everyone, and welcome to another Americans for Limited Government live stream. We have a special report today on the Supreme Court has taken up the issue of President Biden's vax mandates. It's a little complicated, but Rick has been following this closely. There are two cases that the Supreme Court heard today in an emergency measure. So, Rick, do you want to just lay out briefly what the two cases are?
Sure. The first case is on the OSHA regulation, which would make it so employers that have more than 100 employees would be required to fire anybody who did not have a vaccination or was not subjected to very regular tests. So that's the first one. It's the one that we've all heard about, that the OSHA regulation. The second one, it deals with whether or not healthcare workers, for any hospital systems or doctors who use Medicare, who take federal aid, if they can be compelled to fire healthcare workers who are not vaccinated. Those are the two separate cases. And they're in two separate, while they're both in the Supreme Court, they're in opposite positions. The OSHA mandate was, while initially rejected by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which was given jurisdiction over these cases, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals changed that in a 2-to-1 vote, where they said, no, we've got a healthcare emergency and OSHA can do what they want to do. So so right now, what the issue before the Supreme Court is whether or not that ruling should be allowed to go into effect while the larger legal issues get settled later on. The other one, on the healthcare worker case, currently that is not being allowed to go into effect. That has been stayed by the lower courts, and the Supreme Court is being asked to decide whether they should allow the stay to stay in effect. And so both of those circumstances are in exact opposite positions in terms of what they're asking the Supreme Court to do. One hand, OSHA, they want the action to be stayed, the OSHA regulation to be stayed, to be stopped, is what that means. And on the other hand, they want the healthcare worker mandate out of Health and Human Services to be left in place, or the stopping of it to be left in place. And that is the difference, the differentiation, and it gets a little confusing, but bottom line is they're going to decide whether or not they are going to allow these things to actually be implemented right now, if they're going to stop them from being implemented until the Supreme Court gets a chance to look at the legal issues underlying them.
Rick, Robert Hamburger asks, why does OSHA have anything to do with this?
I don't believe OSHA should have anything to do with this. And Robert, you probably don't know, but I did work at the Department of Labor for 2.5 years under George W. Bush. I was in the PR department. I was the head of public affairs, but chief of staff public affairs. But we've been dealing with labor issues at ALG for 11 years. And let me be clear, OSHA is supposed to determine whether or not an employer is putting a bunch of boxes in front of an emergency exit, hence creating a hazard for employees if they were to have to escape in a fire or something. That's their job. Their job is not to be involved in healthcare. Their job is not to be involved in, here are things you should be doing in your workplace because individual workers might be dangerous. And so that's not their job. That's not their mandate. They should not be involved in this. And in fact, I don't believe they constitutionally can be involved in this. But that bottom line is the Biden administration has interjected OSHA into it, has made this a workplace safety issue, and the Supreme Court's going to decide whether or not they're going to allow that mandate, that regulation, that emergency regulation, to be implemented, or if they're going to say, wait a second, no, we're not going to allow it to be implemented. We need to take a bigger look at this constitutionally, because this dramatically expands the size and scope of government and usurps congressional authority to be able to deal with these kind of issues. So that's what Congress is going to do.
Lester says that OSHA is involved. He says because the government can't do it, so this is an end around for them. In fact, Lester is right on. Some of the questions from the justices in the hearings today we're essentially trying to get to that point. The Solicitor General for the Biden administration explained why OSHA was involved, and then she kept citing these sort of detailed, like, code 691D12, whatever. And the justices were somewhat frustrated, and one of them actually said, okay, so this was some sort of workaround. You used OSHA as a workaround because you didn't have executive authority, or so that is, I think, is a valid point.
100%.
Yeah.
100%, Catherine. Lester hit it on the nail on the head. It is, the Biden administration was floundering around trying to figure out some way they could compel. This has nothing about healthcare, by the way. Fauci has admitted it. This is about trying to force people, compel people to get vaccinated. It has nothing to do about workplace safety. And they're trying to figure out a tool they could use to do so. And the tool they came up with is, let's threaten to fire people if they don't actually, if they don't comply. But the federal government doesn't want to do it because we can't. But let's make it so so individual employers, big employers, are compelled to fire people, being threatened with $14,000 person fines. That's what they did. That's how they tried to do it. And it is a workaround. And quite honestly, it was looked at under the Trump administration, and the Department of Labor decided not to go forward with that because it's the wrong way to go.
Rick, and then we have a question here. What is your sense of how the arguments went? Any predictions on the vote in both situations? And Rick, before I get to you to answer that, I want to show a 30-second clip that you're going to hear the audio. This is Chief Justice John Roberts. He sounds like he's mocking the Solicitor General from the Biden administration. The question was, well, how does Congress, because Justice Roberts kept telling the Solicitor General, I think this is something that Congress should have the authority to do. Congress may have the authority to impose a mandate, but he was questioning whether the administration could. And the Solicitor General representing the Biden administration said, oh, we do have the authority. Congress gave it to us in 1970 when Congress created OSHA. And now this is Chief Justice Roberts' response. I think you'll like it.
Flu than it is to today's problem.
Hang on, I'm going to back that up.
That was 50 years ago that you're saying Congress acted. I don't think it had COVID in mind. That was almost closer to the Spanish flu than it is to today's problem. Now, I understand the idea that agencies are more expert than Congress. I understand the idea that they can move more quickly than Congress. But this is something that the federal government has never done before, right? Mandated vaccine coverage.
Okay. So now, Chief Justice Roberts, Rick, you have indicated, and we all sort of know he's often a swing vote, but there he is sounding skeptical and sort of mocking this Biden lawyer when he says that OSHA gave us this authority, Congress gave us authority 50 years ago by creating OSHA. Justice Roberts didn't seem to be buying that. So I'll let you answer the question. Where do you think this is all going?
Sure. The three justices that you would expect would support the Biden administration, Breyer, Sotomayor, and who's the third one? Kagan, all came down and said, we've got a pandemic. We have to do something. Everybody's going to die. Okay, so that was kind of their approach. Quite predictable. The other six justices expressed skepticism in terms of whether or not there was legal authority to proceed. And it was less on the Constitution rather than who should do it. As was brought out in the Roberts question, it was really about, the administration can't just make stuff up. You need to have Congress actually pass legislation to allow you to do this. And this is unprecedented, what you're trying to do. That was what Roberts said. I think that skepticism rang through the six. Now, in terms of guessing on this, I thought there was no way that the court would uphold Obamacare. Okay. No way. I looked at it closely, followed it, read a bunch of stuff, read the various things that were brought up about it. And you know what? Chief Justice Roberts found a way to contort an opinion that moved moved it from the Commerce Clause, which was what the Obama administration was arguing, was that it was covered by the Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, and that this ability to regulate the healthcare field was covered under that. And he said, no, it isn't covered under that. But let me give you some help here, where I'm going to make it based upon the power of taxation. And by Congress creating a tax, a fine for people who don't get Obamacare, they have effectively created a tax. And by creating a tax, they have created a capacity to for Congress to do this. And that's how the Obamacare decision was decided by Chief Justice Roberts. The irony that we have is that Chief Justice Roberts, with that decision, the Commerce Clause is what authorizes OSHA to exist. It is authorized under the Commerce Clause. So the very clause of the Constitution that he rejected for use under Obamacare is now being tried to be used for forcing people to get vaccines, with the threat of being fired being the cudgel. And so he's going to have an interesting decision. What to be consistent, if he wanted to actually say, yes, you can do this, he would have to declare that OSHA's fining capacity was in fact a tax, which would be unprecedented because taxes are collected by the IRS and OSHA fines aren't. So it would create a much dramatic broadening of what is understood to be taxation by the federal government. And he would have to do that. He would have to do that contortion in order to get himself from his decision in the Sebelius case, which was Obamacare, to have it be consistent in this case. I don't think he's going to do it, but bottom line is, I would have lost a lot of money on the Obamacare decision, and so I hesitate to make a judgment in terms of what happened in terms of this. I just know that there's 6 skeptics and there's 3 people who are going to vote yes, or going to vote on the side of the Biden administration, no matter what.
Rick, you may have answered this, but we've been directly asked. In your opinion, does the government, especially the president, under executive order, have the authority to mandate an unapproved FDA shot?
No, they don't. And it's let me just be clear. I don't think the federal government has this authority under the Constitution. I don't think if Congress said that they wanted to do it, the federal government still has the authority under the Constitution. And I don't think state governments have this authority either, because it would be unprecedented for the government to mandate a treatment. Now, we can go back. There was a case around the Spanish flu where they found that you could force people to get the vaccines. I think it was badly decided, but there is some precedent for allowing it. But in my estimation, you have to really, really stretch the capacity and the idea behind individual liberties. You have to really, really stretch them in order to get to forcing somebody to take a vaccine, particularly at this juncture of the fight of the process of the disease cycle. A vaccine that we know doesn't actually prevent you from getting the disease.
Rick, Mark asks, was the issue brought out about the thousands of deaths and over 1 million adverse events from the vaccines? Now, Mark, I listened to much of the hearing, a good amount of it, not all of it, but in nothing did I hear them talk about the adverse reactions. Instead, the conversation was focused on how many lives could be saved if the mandate were put in place.
The Biden administration wanted to argue about how many lives could be saved. And the people who are opposing, the state of Louisiana, which was opposing the imposition, wanted to argue the law. And so they argued the law because you only have so much time, and amicus briefs could go in and about a bunch of other, taking on the context of the number of lives being saved versus cost and the effects of the vaccine. That's perfectly legitimate, and that's part of the conversation outside the courtroom. The bottom line is the reason Kagan and Sotomayor and the Biden solicitor and Breyer wanted to focus on the number of lives that could be saved is because they didn't have a legal argument. They had an emotional argument. And since they didn't have a legal argument, they argued emotion. whereas the law was all on the side of those who say you can't do this. And at the very least, there should be a stay and imposition of the mandate until we get a chance to actually look at the entirety of the situation. What Kagan and the like were arguing essentially was, we have a building on fire emergency, and we've got to get the fire department there now. And that might have been a great argument a year and a half ago. Might have been a great argument a year ago, but it's not an argument now, in my estimation. And as a result, no, they didn't talk. The people who are against the law, who are in favor of stay, did not talk about the vaccine, the problems, the various problems with the vaccine in terms of people dying, over 20,000 people dying from the vaccine, according to the CDC. The hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people who've had adverse impacts, according to the CDC. So they didn't talk about that, because when you have the law on your side, you always argue the law. When you don't have the law on your side, you argue emotion. And that's everything you need to know about this argument. Is the left argued emotion because they don't have the law on their side, and the people trying to stop this nonsense argued the law because they didn't need the emotion. However, I think it's really important that if this is stayed, and if we have a bigger case, that groups like Americans for Limited Government bring out the deleterious effect of the vaccines to offset the emotional argument.
I just want to thank everyone for joining us. We sent out an email, so thank you to all of you who opened your email, who have been getting our emails each day. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the little bell. That will make sure that you get notifications anytime we do these live videos. We really want to bring you into our organization just as a supporter and a follower, and to be a part of our fight. So definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel. And thank you for opening that email and joining the conversation today. And Rick, Helen makes the point. She says, save the children, no vax mandate. And obviously she's referring to these, I don't think any states have done it, but we've seen it in localities. School districts are requiring vax mandates for children. Today's hearing was not related to vax mandates for children. Today's hearing covered two issues. One, the vax mandate that would affect companies that have 100 or more workers. And then secondly, the vax mandates for healthcare workers, anyone who works at a hospital that takes Medicare or Medicaid funding, which is virtually all hospitals. So those are the two mandates that were looked at today. Nothing related to children.
But Helen, in terms of your point, if individual people decide that they want to vaccinate their children, first of all, I think it's insane that the vaccinations for children were approved without really any kind of testing, and without a real decision about the cost benefit analysis, given that kids don't die from this disease. The cost benefit is insane in terms of anybody looking at it and saying that they should have opened the door for it. However, in my estimation, now, quite honestly, people in my staff don't always agree with me on everything, but that's my personal opinion on it. But this didn't deal with that. But from a standpoint of they should not compel parents to get their kids vaccinated in order to be able to go to school. They should not compel parents to get their kids vaccinated under any circumstances. And it's not just because kids don't die from the disease. It's because we know, but nobody knows the long-term effect of this vaccine on children's health. And we have had at least one instance in history when we had a vaccine for German measles in the 1950s that turned out to have crippling, horrible impacts. But we didn't know until 10 years later. And yet people were sticking this vaccine into kids. And we discovered the outcome when those kids grew up and they had children, and those children had a lot of deformities and the like that was directly related to the vaccine. So it would be absolutely a miscarriage of any kind of proper healthcare practice to enforce the vaccination of children. And I really question whether the wisdom of the federal public health agencies from approving it when they have absolutely no idea what the adverse impacts are downstream to those very children who, by the way, have almost zero risk of dying from this disease.
Rick, what about, does this rule or this testing employees hurt low-income minorities the most? There actually is quite a bit of evidence that minorities are disparately impacted.
100%. This is a great question. In fact, when they first announced this, most of you probably don't know, but I wrote a book with Star Parker of Core Online, and Star has been basically since 1992 has been in the forefront of fighting against the welfare state and the negative impact it has on the minority communities. And so I wrote a book with her called Necessary Noise last year or 2 years ago, something like that. Anyway, I was talking to her immediately when this came out, and I said, listen, this is a disparate impact. This is the craziest thing in the world, because the entire argument the left has about disparate impact and things having a disparate impact on minority communities and white privilege and all that is completely reversed by this. Because obviously, if you are firing people who don't have vaccinations, and you have and people, as they would contend, people in low-income communities have less access to vaccines and medicines and the like, which they always contend, then in fact you are creating a standard that has to have a more of an impact on minority communities and low income communities than higher and middle income communities. Certainly, if the left can argue that having a driver's license is discriminatory against minority communities, you'd have to guess that having a test, a COVID test, an approvable vaccination card would be much more difficult. And if there is this big barrier between minorities and the majority population getting driver's licenses, you have to assert that the same would be true under this particular under any kind of vaccine mandate. And to throw people out of work because they don't have a vaccine, who are working day and night to try to keep their kids fed and get basically move ahead in their lives, it's not only it's evil, it's wrong, it's cruel, and it's typical of the left, who claim to pretend that they want to support minorities, when in fact government intervention always harms them.
And Teresa asks, how could the justices find reason to allow vaccine mandates of any kind based on the Constitution? And Rick, I'll just start off with this one. So that's the court. What they were hearing today was there's the merit of the case, which they actually weren't even deciding on that. Today's hearing was simply to decide whether or not to keep the injunction in place, where they don't let the mandate move forward in one case, or in another case to let it move forward. In any event, the merit of the question is what you are asking about. And what we heard from President Biden's Solicitor General, that's the person who was there to argue on behalf of these mandates. They claim that the Constitution gives them the authority by way of the Occupational Safety Health Administration, OSHA, which was created by Congress in 1970. That's the constitutional hook that they can hang down.
And once again, OSHA was created as a part of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which allows the federal government to have cross-state regulations. And so that's where OSHA was. That's the constitutional justification for OSHA. And so when you get down to it, if they allow an emergency OSHA regulation that doesn't go through the normal process, doesn't have comments, doesn't have anything that's normal about a regulation, to just be imposed and cost millions of Americans their jobs, in my estimation, there are very few brakes on the power of the federal government to affect the private marketplace, to compel action, and to create effectively the exact kind of culture war, the attack on individual decision making and individual freedom that we see with the Chinese government and their base culture cultural attacks when somebody doesn't agree with them, where they deprive them the ability to work, they deprive them the ability to get on a plane, they deprive them the ability to have a car, and that is they don't. And in some cases, they kill them, but this whole cultural scorecard idea that comes out of China, if the Supreme Court allows this to go forward, they will have allowed the U.S. government to do that under the thin veil of an emergency. And as we know, anything can be declared an emergency if you get enough Facebook posts declaring it to be one.
Rick, and Helen makes that point. We are letting illegals come in unrestricted, no testing. If that doesn't cause an emergency, nothing else does. So that was one of the issues that the justices did discuss today was, as you mentioned earlier, this has been going on now for almost 2 years. Like an emergency is a short-term thing. So that very much is being called into question, I think, with these mandates, because OSHA is restricted to some sort of an emergency situation. And so that's a question the justices are looking at.
Yeah, it's and that's kind of an interesting legal thing, which has, I think, bearing on this case, but is a little bit scary in a broader sense. And you're right, in terms of the illegals coming across, unrestricted, being sent around to every state in the nation, not tested, no vaccine, nothing, just basically shipped around, if the Biden administration, by doing that, by invoking that policy, argues against their very case that this is an emergency that should be imposed on Americans, because they're not imposing it on foreigners who don't belong here, who come here illegally and should not be allowed to come into the country at all. So given that disparity of treatment, I think they argue against their own case. But the fact of the matter is, if this goes forward, I think a reasonable argument could be made. And unfortunately, I'm not rooting for it to go forward because of this, but I think a reasonable argument could be made by a subsequent administration that we have an emergency based upon the flooding of our nation by illegal immigrants. And as a result, there's going to be an emergency order that there should be mass arrests and deportations and basically 1 month of immigration sweeps that deports millions of people from the country. And that would be perfectly within the law, because they broke the law, and it would be perfectly legal because if an emergency, under an emergency declaration, to mobilize those resources to do that. And so at some level, it really kills that possibility should, from the left's perspective, should scare them about making this determination, because if the Supreme Court rules that you can declare anything to be an emergency and an emergency can last for years and years and years, then it opens the door to an executive branch to do anything they want to with very little legal justification and effectively ignore the law and just enact policies absent any of the other two branches of government's input. It's dangerous, it's stupid, and while I would support the deportation of people who are illegally here, I use that as an example since it's one on the left that they would scream up and down about civil rights and civil liberties if it were to occur.
So, Rick, as we prepare to wrap it up, I just first of all want to say thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the little bell that'll get you notifications of when we do these live streams. We are so grateful for your participation and your questions. And Teresa asks, Rick, what are your thoughts about how the court will rule? And what's the timeline for that? And what are their options?
Well, in terms of ruling on the stays, one to keep a stay and one to eliminate a stay, that's likely to happen. That'll happen rapidly. It could happen today. It could happen on Monday. Because this is an emergency hearing based on something that's being dealt with right now. The stay, if no matter how they rule, there will be an appeal to the full, appeal to sit there and say, hey, wait a second, we want the full court to take up the legal issues, at which point you get the legal issues discussed later on. And we'd end up with the same set of arguments, but it is a pretty big bellwether of where the Supreme Court is going to go under a stay. So if they allow the law to be stopped, it would tell you that there's a majority of the people who are skeptical enough about the legal ability to do this that they're going to stop the law so they can take a bigger look at it. Then the bigger case is important. But if they lift the stay and they say, yeah, you can implement, the carts, it's the horses out of the barn at that point. And there really is, they've basically said, we don't believe that there is a legal case that will prevail against this, the OSHA mandate or the effort by HHS to stop hospitals or force hospitals to fire unvaxxed employees. And if they believe that there's no legal case, it will likely be prevail, and they lift that stay, they effectively open the door for the Biden to do whatever you want to do. If that happens, the court case is already decided, and future SCOTUS actions on it are somewhat futile. And in fact, you really don't want them to make a ruling on it, because the ruling will be bad, and it will be bad for freedom and individual liberty. So the key thing here is that they stay it, that's good. If they allow it to occur, that's bad. If they stay it, there'll be a future court battle over the legal issues. If they allow it to occur, I don't believe there will be a future court battle, and we will then have to fight it on a totally different level. And and that would be disastrous for freedom in America.
Well, thank you, Rick. And thank you all for being a part of our live stream today. And we hope that you do subscribe to our channel. Just hit the bell so you get notifications of when we go live and when we have new videos up. And Rick, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, Catherine, one of the things we were going to talk about, and I'm glad we had this level of discussion on the court case, but we were going to talk a little bit about the jobs report today. So I just want people to hear this because I think it's really important to know. Since June of this year, June of 2021, the number of people who are employed has gone through the roof. It's an amazing employment gain in this country. In 2021 alone, you had about 4 million more people employed. That's an enormous number. But Joe Biden has nothing to do with it. The reason I point to the June, July time period is because that's when we started seeing rapid growth in employment. And the reason we started seeing it is because Republican governors in June started saying, no, we're not going to pay people to stay unemployed. We're not going to pay them extra money to be unemployed. We have lots of jobs. We need people in those jobs. So the policy of stopping the unemployment, paying people to be unemployed, actually ignited the employment boom. And then in September, because of complaints by people like Americans for Limited Government constantly pressing on this issue, what happened was the federal government allowed for that additional employment compensation to go away, and it sunsetted out. And in spite of the efforts of Democrats, it ended up sunsetting out. And we have seen over the last 4 months, states that were having 8-10% unemployment rates, now their unemployment rates are dropping to like a rock. And so those blue states are now catching up because they're no longer paying people to be unemployed, paying people extra money to be unemployed. As a result, what we're seeing is an affirmation of that markets work and government intervention fails. And so when we sit there and we look at the numbers, the headlines today were disappointing job number. The fact is the job number was spectacular in terms of the simple fact that we have a 3.9% unemployment rate. We don't have everybody back in the economy who we need to have back in the economy, but we have an unemployment rate that is coming back down to where it was before the pandemic. And the Democrat policies have nothing to do with it. It's about the market, about free enterprise working. And as a result, we have a great story to tell about freedom and how when you let markets work, they work. And American people want to get a job. They don't want to sit on the sidelines and collect government dole, because once it stopped being profitable to sit on the sidelines, they went out and got jobs. And that is a great thing. That is a great thing. The problem is Biden's going to take credit for it. And Biden was actually the person who's put a big restrictor plate on the growth of the economy and the growth of jobs in this country. And so he actually bears the responsibility for why it took so long. But I just wanted to make that point because you won't hear it anywhere else. And it's important. And this is something we follow really closely, because I don't really care if employers are creating jobs. It's a number that matters, but it's kind of up and down. The thing that matters is, are Americans employed? Can people get a job if they want a job? Because if you can get a job and you want a job, then you have the freedom of mobility to change jobs and to go and follow your dreams. And ultimately, America is about being able to follow your dreams and not being a slave to any employer. And so when jobs are plentiful and people are involved in the marketplace and they're switching jobs and they're doing different things, that is great, because it means people are exercising their individual freedoms. And as somebody who loves liberty, I love it when people are exercising their individual freedoms, unless they tell me they want to leave America's for limited government, and then I'm all bummed out. But apart from that, this is really a good sign. America's getting back to work. Americans are working, and the meme that Americans don't want to work is being proven to be false. And that is a great sign for the future. And I don't think people should miss it. And you won't read that in anywhere else, in any publications, because nobody focuses on it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And if we don't talk to you until Monday, have a great weekend. And hopefully we'll be back Monday. In fact, I will be back Monday. I just booked a special guest for our live stream Monday afternoon. One of the vice presidents at the Media Research Center is going to come on and talk to me about how the social media landscape is dramatically shifting away from the Facebooks and the giant techs that have grown up in Silicon Valley in favor of some of these new, more emerging platforms. So we will be talking with a vice president at Media Research Center on Monday. So stay tuned for my next Americans for Limited Government live stream.
Excellent. Take care, guys.